The House on the Cliff, Chapter 7, Bound and Gagged. The Hardy boys were astonished by this information. Their father, tapping a pencil quickly on the desk, leaned forward in his chair. "You may have stumbled on some information of great value," he said to them quietly. "I need hardly tell you that it's best to keep it to yourself. If Gainey Snakely is operating in this vicinity, it will be a great feather in our caps to catch him." "It's an unusual name," remarked Frank. "I'll bet that's the Snakely our man meant, all right. And the farmer said there was smuggling going on in the bay," Joey pointed out. "Of course, there's always been more or less smuggling carried on at Barmont Bay, but it's been on a small scale. Gainey Snakely and his gang are international smugglers. The last I heard of him, he was operating up on the New England coast. But probably things grew too hot for him, and he moved down here. He seems to have dropped off completely out of sight for the past 6 months or so. Perhaps this man Jones at the farmhouse will talk later on." "I'm going out there to interview him," said Fenton Hardy. "I'll wait a few days until he's feeling better. Of course the matter is for the United States authorities, and as I haven't been assigned to the case, I can't do very much. But perhaps I'll get some information, and I can use it at some other time. Joe and I will go out tomorrow and see how he's getting along." "Do so, but don't ask any questions. Don't let him think you are suspicious of him. Otherwise, he'll be liable to sneak away as soon as he can, and we'll lose him altogether. He's under an obligation to you now because you saved his life. So it will seem quite natural for you to come back to see him. If you think he is recovering quickly, let me know, and I'll go out right away and talk to him. If you think he will be there for several days, we'll just let him stay until he feels better." "Perhaps he's a detective himself," Frank suggested. "That had occurred to me," admitted Mr. Hardy. "If that's the case, I'll keep out of the affair. It's just probable that he is a Secret Service man who discovered Snakely's hangout and was shot for his pains. That would explain why he would not tell you anything about himself, but there's always the possibility that he is one of Snakely's enemies, and in that case, I may be able to persuade him to talk." Fenton Hardy asked the boys more questions about their adventures, but beyond a few trivial details, they were unable to throw any further light on the mystery. However, it was decided that they should go back to the Kane farmhouse on the following day, which was Sunday, and report on the condition of the mysterious Mr. Jones. With that, they left their father, spending the rest of the afternoon in eager discussions and speculation concerning the strange events of the day. It had been an eventful holiday for them, and although they went over the incident time and again, they were unable to arrive at any solution of the puzzling affair in Barmont Bay. As for the happenings at the house on the cliff, they were inclined to accept their father's theory that some practical joker had been to blame. Next morning after church, they took the motorcycles out of the garage and prepared to ride out to the Kane farmhouse, there to make inquiries as to the condition of the man they had rescued on the previous day. "Remember," warned their father, "don't ask him too many questions, or he'll get suspicious. Just find out how long he's likely to remain at the farm. If his injuries aren't very serious, he'll be leaving in a few days, or so. We want to check up on him then." The boys promised to follow the detective's instructions. Unlike the day previously, this Sunday was clear and bright, and the rain of the afternoon before had laid the dust, so that they enjoyed their journey out along the shore road. "It would be a joke on us if Mr. Jones left before we got there," remarked Joe. "I don't think he will. That wound in his side was enough to keep him laid up for a few days anyway. He lost so much blood yesterday that it would take him a while to get back his strength." "I hope he isn't a detective. Why?" "It would be great if we could get a chance and do some work on this case ourselves. If Gainy Snakely is in this neighborhood and the government detectives don't know of it, we would help Dad land him." "It would be a great chance," admitted Frank. "But I think we'll find our friend Jones is a detective. That is, if we ever find out anything definite about him. Why else should Snakely and his man try to kill him? For there's no doubt they left him for dead. Perhaps he was another smuggler that wanted to get rid of. Maybe, but I think it's most likely he's a Secret Service man." At length they arrived at the lane leading from the main road to the farmhouse. As their motorcycles roared down the drive, they watched for some sign of life about the place. But there was no one in the orchard or in the barnyard. No one came out of the house. The place appeared to be deserted, and although it was a warm day, the doors were closed. "This is weird," remarked Frank, as they brought their motorcycles to a stop and left them in the shade of a large tree near the back of the house. "Mr. and Mrs. Kane couldn't have gone away and left Jones here alone, could they?" The boys went up to the door and rapped. There was no answer. "Try the front door," Joe suggested. After a number of futile efforts, they went to the front door of the farmhouse. But here, although they banged on the panels, there was likewise no response. "They must have gone out," said Joe. "But what about Jones? They wouldn't have left him here alone. I can't understand this." They went to the back door and rapped again and again. Still there was no answer. Frank tried the doorknob and found that the door swung open. "They didn't lock the place up anyway," he said. "Let's go in. If Jones is upstairs, we'll go up and see him. Mr. Kane won't mind. Probably they didn't expect callers today." They went into the kitchen, and here they were surprised by the scene of disorder that greeted their gaze. The previous day they had been impressed by the neatness of the room, for Mrs. Kane was evidently the soul of tidiness. Now the kitchen looked as though an earthquake had shaken it. Pots and pans were strewn about the floor. The table had been overturned. A chair lay upside down in the corner. A few cups and saucers lay in shattered bits beside the stove. The wood box had been upset, and the wood was scattered about. One window curtain had been partly torn from its fastenings. "What on earth has happened here?" Frank exclaimed, in profound astonishment. "Looks as if a cyclone came through. There's something funny about this. There's been a fight or a struggle of some kind here. Let's see what the rest of the house looks like." The Hardy boys rushed into the next room, and their unexpected sight met their eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Kane were seated in chairs in the middle of the room. They were unable to move, unable to speak, scarcely able to make a struggle. The farmer and his wife were bound and gagged, tied to their chairs. Chapter 8. The Stolen Witness. Swiftly the Hardy boys rushed over to Mr. and Mrs. Kane and began to release them. The farmer and his wife had been trussed up by the strong ropes. They had been so well gagged that they had been unable to utter a sound. It was only a matter of a few minutes, however, before their bonds were loosened and the gags removed. "Thank goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Kane, with a sigh of relief as the gag had been taken away. Her husband, sputtering with rage, rose from his chair and hurled the ropes to one side. "What happened?" asked the boys in amazement. For a moment Mr. and Mrs. Kane were unable to give a coherent account of their experience, owing to the strain they had undergone. But at last the farmer stumbled over to the window and pointed down the shore road. "They went that way," he roared. "That way. Follow them." "Who?" "The rascals that tied us up. They took Jones away with them." "Kidnapped him?" "Yes, kidnapped him. There were 4 of them. They broke in here and tied up my wife and me. Then they went upstairs, carried Jones away with them. They dumped him into an automobile and made a getaway. 4 men? 4 of the ugliest-looking scoundrels you ever laid your eyes on." "How long ago?" said Frank quickly. "They didn't leave 10 minutes ago. If you had been here just a few minutes earlier, you would have met the whole crowd of them." The farmer was angry and excited. "But there's time yet. You can catch 'em." They went down the shore road. "Come on, Joe," shouted Frank. "Let's chase them. They've kidnapped Jones." Joe needed no urging. The Hardy Boys left the farmer and his wife rubbing their chafed wrists and ankles and hastened out of the house over to their motorcycles. Within a few seconds, the staccato roar of a powerful machine broke out on the still air, and then they went rocking and swaying down the lane out on the shore road. "Some high-handed proceedings, I'll say," yelled Frank, to make himself heard above the roaring of the motorcycles. "Those rascals ought to be in prison," returned his brother. The boys followed in the direction the farmer had indicated. Frank then recollected that just before they had turned towards the Kane farm, he had seen a cloud of dust down the main road, evidently caused by a speeding automobile. But he had thought nothing of it at the time, for the traffic along the shore highway occasioned no comment, especially on Sunday. "If we had only been here earlier," he groaned. "We'll catch up to them. They haven't much of a start. Maybe we can follow them to some town and have the whole gang arrested." The motorcycles roared along at top speed. Both the Hardy Boys were skillful drivers, and for a while Frank was able to follow the course of the car they were pursuing by watching the fresh tread marks in the dust. But when the road came to the place where it intersected with the road leading up to the Morton farm, the tread mark became lost, as evidently another car had turned out of the side road in the meantime and obliterated the fresh tread marks. They passed the lane that led into the Palooka place and continued on down the shore road until they came to a hilltop that commanded a view of a wide stretch of country. Here they could see the road winding and dipping for a distance and more than a mile until it was lost to sight in a grove of trees. But there was no sign of an automobile they were seeking. "They've given us the slip, I guess," said Frank, as he brought his motorcycle to a stop. "They had a good start, and they weren't letting the grass grow under their feet either. Think we should keep on?" "There's not much use. We'd better go back to the farmhouse and hear what Mr. and Mrs. Kane have to say about this." They turned their motorcycles about and headed back towards the farm. On the way they discussed the mysterious kidnapping. "Evidently those men and the other motorboat saw us rescue Jones, or else they heard that he had been taken to the farmhouse," remarked Joe. "They must be desperate characters." "I wonder what will happen to poor Jones now," Frank said gravely. "They tried to kill him in the first place. This time, do you think they'll murder him?" "It looks like that. They didn't show him any mercy out on the bay. They left him for dead that time. Now they'll make sure of it." Joe shuddered. "If they were going to kill him, they'd hardly go to all the bother of kidnapping him," he pointed out. "Perhaps they just want to keep him out of the way. Perhaps they were afraid he would tell about their chasing him and setting fire to his motorboat. They were mighty anxious to get their hands on him. Then they would come to the house in broad daylight and tie up Mr. and Mrs. Kane. Gee, it's lucky we came along when we did. They might have been left there for hours without being able to get loose." When they got back to the farmhouse, they found that the farmer and his wife had somewhat recovered from their harrowing experience, although they were still unnerved. Mrs. Kane, ever the true housewife, was already beginning to tidy up the kitchen and living room, for the intruders had upset everything in the struggle. "We lost them," said Frank. Kane nodded. "I didn't think you'd catch them," he said. "They left here in too much of a hurry, but I hoped you would. They had a big, high-powered car, and they didn't waste any time getting away." "There were 4 of them, you said." 4 ugly villains." "What did they look like?" "I didn't get much of a chance to see them. It all happened too quick. One of them came to the door. He was a tall chap with a thin face, and asked if I was looking after a man who was almost drowned yesterday. I said that I was, so he told me he had come to take him away, that he was a brother of the fellow. I got kind of suspicious, and asked him his name. But in the meantime, I had stepped outside the door, and before I knew it, someone jumped at me from behind. I put up a fight as best I could, but the others came at me from around the corner of the house where they had been hiding, and before I knew it, I was tied up. And then they tied up my wife and left us in the living room while they went upstairs. Did Jones put up a fight when they took him away? He tried to. He hollered for help, but of course I couldn't do nothing, and he was too weak to fight much himself. They carried him downstairs and put him in an automobile, and then they drove away. There must be more to this affair than we imagined, reflected Frank. It's getting serious when you break into a private home like this. You bet it's getting serious, exclaimed the farmer. It'll be mighty serious for them if they try it again. He motioned to the table where a shotgun was laying. I've got that gun loaded and waiting for the next gang that tries anything like that. I only wish I'd had it ready this morning. I don't think you'll have any cause to use it, Frank said reassuringly. It was Jones they were after. They won't bother you again. They'd better not. I think the best thing we can do, Joe, is to go right back to Bayport and let Dad know about this. Good idea. We can't do anything by staying here. You boys said yesterday that your names was Hardy, said the farmer. Ain't any relation to Fenton Hardy, are you? He's our father. The detective? The Hardy boys nodded assent. Good, exclaimed Kane. You go right back and tell him about this. If anyone can get to the bottom of this affair, it's him. I hate to see them rascals getting away scot-free. Frank and Joe bade good-bye to the farmer and his wife and returned to their motorcycles. They promised to call again at the Kane farm as soon as they had any further information, and Mr. Kane, in turn, gave his promise to notify them if there were any further trace of the kidnappers or the mysterious Mr. Jones. When they returned to Bayport, the boys lost no time in reaching home. Fenton Hardy was enjoying one of his rare afternoons of leisure in reading, but he put his book aside when the boys rushed into the library. Did Mr. Jones talk? He asked quickly, seeing by their expression that something unusual had happened. We didn't have a chance to see him, exclaimed Joe. What's the matter? Did he clear out? He was kidnapped. Kidnapped? 4 men broke into the farmhouse and took him away, said Frank hurriedly. Then he proceeded to tell the story of the strange events of the morning at the Kane farm, prompted occasionally by Joe. Mr. Hardy was deeply interested. There's only one theory I can make of it, he said at last. This Jones, or whatever his name is, must have belonged to a gang and either squealed on them or threatened to do so. They tried to get rid of him, and he escaped in the motorboat, but they thought they had finished him in the explosion. Then they found out that he had been rescued, so they went to the farmhouse and took him away before he had a chance to talk. Do you think they're smugglers? Probably. While you were away this morning, I called up on the government authorities in the city and told them that we believe there might be smugglers operating in Barmont Bay on a big scale. Did you tell him about Snakely? Mr. Hardy smiled. Not yet. That information I thought I'd keep for myself, for the time being. But I wonder if Snakely can be here. It begins to look like it. He is the kind who wouldn't stop at anything from kidnapping to murder. Do the authorities suspect him of being around here? I imagine so. The man I was talking to mentioned the fact that the smugglers they are after are in a drug line. And Snakely is king of the dope smugglers on the Atlantic coast. Gee, I wish we could land him. Of course, said Fenton Hardy. No one has asked us to work on this case, and I don't believe in working for nothing. You mean you want help? Asked Joe in disappointment. Finton Hardy's eyes twinkled as he went on. I don't believe in working for nothing, he repeated, but if we ever caught this man Snakely, it would be worth it. Why? The reward? Is there a reward offered for him? There has been a standing reward of $5,000 offered for Snakely's capture for some time, and if he is operating in Barmont Bay, as I suspect, it's just possible that we might be able to collect that reward. Good, exclaimed Frank. Let's go after it.